On behalf of CO2 India Network, I welcome Professor Vijay Raghavan, and also like to welcome Professor Anil Kakurkar, Professor Lakshmi Kantam, Professor Satish Ogle, our respected advisory members joining this webinar. So I'm Vivek Pulshettiwar. I'm Associate Professor at TIFR Mumbai, and I'm going to be your today's host for today's webinar. Climate change due to excessive carbon dioxide is the most serious problem mankind has ever faced. Capture and then conversion of CO2 to useful materials and fuels are the best way to tackle these challenges. Carbon dioxide should become our preferred carbon source for manufacturing chemicals, fuels, cement, steel, almost everything that we need every day. For self-reliant CO2 capture and conversion technologies, we must invest in fundamental research with translational goals for technology development. Dr. Homi Bhabha built Department of Atomic Energy and gave India nuclear power, the best example of indigenous development and Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now it's time to harvest solar power and CO2 for India's growth. This will help us to achieve carbon neutrality, India's path to net zero. CO2 India Network, which now has more than 800 members, aims to bring together Indian researchers from across the field of science and engineering who are working on CO2 related topics. This network also aims to connect researchers with industries and policymakers. Indian government is taking extraordinary initiatives to tackle the climate crisis. Hydrogen mission, solar energy mission, water mission are some of the best examples. It's very urgent that we take radical steps and move at an extremely fast speed to achieve India's net zero goals. And today, it's my great honor to welcome Professor K. Vijay Raghavan, Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation. And we all are eager to listen to you, your views on climate change, hydrogen, and government's other plans to combat climate change. I now request Professor Tapas Majhi to kindly introduce Professor K. Vijay Raghavan. Over to you, Tapas.
Yes. Thank you, Vivek. So good evening to all of you. So it is a great privilege and honor for me to introduce today's speaker, Professor Dr. K. Vijay Raghavan, FRS Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, for the owner of CO2 India Network. Dr. Vijay Raghavan graduated with a Bachelor of Technology degree in Chemical Engineering from IIT Kanpur in 1975 and a Master's in 1977. He completed his doctoral degree in 1983 in the field of molecular biology from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. He has conducted his postdoctoral work at the California Institute of Technology during 1984 to 88. In 1988, he joined the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research as a reader. He was instrumental in establishing the National Center for Biological Sciences, popularly known as NCBS, at Bangalore, under the aegis of Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in 1992. He was director of the NCBS, and currently he continues as a distinguished professor in the field of developmental genetics. His field of specialization are development biology, genetics, and neurogenetics. His research primarily focuses on the important principles and mechanisms that control the nervous systems and muscles during development and how these neuromuscular systems direct specific locomotor behaviors. This was achieved by the using of fruit fly Drosophila melanogaster as a model system. Professor Vijay Raghavan received several recognitions for his outstanding contribution in the field of science and technology. To name a few, in 1997, he was elected Fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences. In 1998, he received Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize for Science and Technology Award by the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. In 1999, he became an honorary faculty member of the Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, JNCSR, where I am also belong from. In the same year, he became a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy. He became a member of the editorial board of Journal of Genetics in the year 2000 and a member of Asia Pacific International Molecular Biology Network in the year 2001. In 2003, he received Distinguished Alumnus Award of IIT Kanpur.
Apash, sorry to interrupt, but you'll take up all the time for the talk.
No, another 2 minutes.
No.
Yeah. He is also recipient of the Emphasis Prize in the Life Sciences category in 2009. And 2010, he was elected Fellow of TWAS, the Academy of Sciences for the Developing World. 2012, he received the H.K. Firudi Award for his original contribution to the field of life sciences, particularly to developmental biology, genetics, and neurogenetics. In 2012, he became Fellow of Royal Society. 2013, he conferred the Padma Shri by the President of India. 2014, he was elected Foreign Associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. In 2021, he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. Professor Vijay Raghavan is a member of the Board of Governors of the Akinya Institute of Science and Technology and a senior editor of the journal eLife. Professor Vijay Raghavan served as the secretary of the DBT, Department of Biotechnology, during 2013 to 2018. In March 2018, he was appointed as Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India and continuing. And he has taken major initiative as PSA, which made a significant impact on the science, technology, and innovation landscape of the country. He established the Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council, an overreaching council that facilitated the PSA's office to assess the status in specific science and technology domains, comprehend challenges, formulate intervention, develop a futuristic roadmap, and advise the Prime Ministers accordingly. There are major objectives of the Council, to name a few: formulating and coordinating major interministerial science and technology missions, ensuring an enabling ecosystem for technology-led innovations and entrepreneurship, solving socio-economic challenges for sustainable growth by innovation and technology-based solutions. He has also established Empower Technology Group with the approval of the Union Cabinet, which aims to proactively lay down, coordinate, and oversee national-level policies relating to procurement of and induction of technologies, research and development in technologies that require large outlays in resources, both financial and human, and render sound and timely advice for determining direction and trajectory of government's R&D and technology development programs. With these introductions, now I request Professor Vijay Raghavan to deliver his webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tapas and Vivek. I should just say any questions and leave it there. I am a bit embarrassed to give this talk in the presence of all of you and also Dr. Anil Kakodkar. There's the gradient of information flow is more from the screen to me than the other way around, both information, knowledge, and understanding. So please keep that in mind. And keeping that in mind, I would say that if you can at least, I will keep my talk brief, and if we can have substantial time for interactions to see what is happening, what needs to be done, that would be, I think, much more productive from our point of view. So I presume all of you can see the screen. I will try to put it in, the play mode, but in case it doesn't move, that there could be a problem. Let me just see. Good. Good. Okay. Now let's then get started. I'll try to be brief, as I said, and leave time for questions. And please keep putting questions in the chat box, which Vivek and Tapas can, collate and ask, not only to me, but there are people such as Dr. Kakodkar and others who will be better positioned to answer most of them. So this presentation, I should say, was developed with a colleague, Mr. Shashi Shekhar. He was the secretary in the Department of Water Resources, but importantly, he's passionate about renewable energy and particularly about hydrogen. So credit for this presentation really goes to him. Now, of course, we face major challenges, high air pollution, imported fossil fuel, and therefore, renewable energy amplification and addressing environmental issues is the major challenge. And all of us know this. Now, our fossil fuel import is unsustainably high, that of course, and this is over 160 billion annually. Our carbon emission is amongst the second highest in the world. And of course, as a developing economy, while developed countries need to cut more rapidly, we are meeting substantially our carbon reduction goals but at the same time, we have to keep in mind our developmental needs. And, going on to air pollution, most of the major polluted cities in the world are in India, the major cities. I am in New Delhi, which faces a particularly severe problem. This results in life expectancy reduction, compromise in cognitive ability. If you're facing polluted environments growing up, it's not a good thing. It's a loss in GDP and electricity generation, transport sector, industrial heating and agriculture. All of this contribute to a substantial part of our carbon emission. Now, if we take a quick glance at our imports, they consist of crude oil, natural gas, coal, petroleum products, and ammonia. And you can see the numbers. I will not systematically read them out, but the bottom shows that our total energy fuel import bill is greater than US $160 billion. And our total greenhouse gas emissions is something like 3,200 metric tons of CO2 emissions, which is again very huge. So what is the roadmap to achieve energy security and self-sufficiency? And at the outset, let me tell you, and Dr. Kakodkar has conveyed this beautifully many times, and in fact, in one of your lectures, that we need to combine a portfolio of various energy sources, of which nuclear will play an important part, and that is something which we must keep in mind. And the reason is, while we have a passion for other renewable energy sources and so on and so forth, wind and solar in particular, while they do not result in fossil fuel use or emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the environmental impact of having renewable energy on a huge scale is a factor which will need to be considered as we expand that. So therefore, a balanced portfolio is very important. Now, so our strategy of 175 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2022 will have to address a energy demand, and electricity constitutes only 17% of our energy needs. So our strategy must include transportation, industry, fertilizer, and so on and so forth. Now, our green hydrogen provides a roadmap to achieve energy security and pollution abatement, and also ensure India continues on the growth path. Now, this will be a question which will be asked and will come up again and again. In terms of energy efficiency, hydrogen production requires putting in more energy than we get out. So it is not that hydrogen is more efficient in that way. Hydrogen has value because of other reasons, and that's something which we will see. But you require energy to produce hydrogen, and the inefficiencies of the process and the inefficiencies of hydrogen fuel cell and other aspects of transportation means effectively you are putting in more energy than you're getting out. And yet, does hydrogen have value or not? So green hydrogen is produced, as you know, by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, powered by renewable energy, and it doesn't produce CO2, as opposed to other forms of hydrogen being produced, other processes for producing hydrogen, which will result in either the use of fossil fuels or in production of greenhouse gases. So that's the route to sustainable energy. The transportation and storage of hydrogen is a huge challenge. It can be transported perhaps by converting to ammonia and methanol. The conversion technology is simple and it's in use for a long time. Ammonia can be cracked to reproduce hydrogen at consumption location, and ammonia, of course, has other applications. So that is one route. Compressing hydrogen and transporting it directly is another route which many countries are rapidly developing large-scale technologies. Let me just 1 second. Yeah, someone asked whether there's a question in the chat box, unfortunately, which I will get to later on. And yeah, I just got distracted by that. Now, the way forward is to look at green hydrogen and green ammonia as areas of application. And they have got enormous application in terms of urea, power storage, refrigeration, textiles, pesticides, dyes, plastics, other chemicals, and so on. In this context, let me tell you in passing that the use of fertilizers. Fertilizers again is an enormous import bill, and therefore, basically it's indirectly a consequence of fossil fuel import. And the Haber-Bosch process was invented and allowed the capture of nitrogen from the atmosphere to make ammonia and then fertilizers. But with the advent of fossil fuel availability, many fertilizers came from other processes. So in many ways, the growth of human populations and human civilizations post the early 20th century, all of them owe substantially to the Haber-Bosch process, and we're coming back to that in many ways. The applications are also in refineries, transportation. Steel and cement are enormous users of energy, and if you could replace the current fossil fuel derived energy use over there with more renewable and hydrogen related energy use, we would be saving a lot. So green hydrogen and green ammonia can result in zero carbon emission in the entire chain. But again, keep in mind the expenses, which I'll come to later. Now, hydrogen from renewable energy, green hydrogen, can relate through various peak and base power support to the grid. It can give that, and it can result in the production of methanol, a hydrogen-powered vehicle, ammonia, synthetic fuel of various kinds, in steel making, oil, and industrial heating, and so on and so forth. So this relationship with the grid on one side and renewable energy on the other, and hydrogen used to look at peak and base power balance in some ways could be very useful. Now, the global hydrogen demand, about 15, 20 years ago, there was a great movement about how much hydrogen is going to come in and replace everything. And we are going through that phase again now. Is that valid? And if so, what are the routes to making that work, and what are the concerns? Now, today, the global hydrogen demand is fueled by greenhouse gas reduction, as distinct from availability of fuel and requirement for fuel. So the push on greenhouse gas emission reduction is a very important push. And about 30-ish nations have national strategy with a timeline to promote green hydrogen. And they are creating a huge demand for green hydrogen and for ammonia. And India, on the ramparts of the Red Fort, the Prime Minister recently, the last Independence Day, also announced the taking off of the hydrogen mission in India. Now, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and other Middle East countries are heavily investing to become green hydrogen or ammonia export hubs. So in other words, they're generating power through solar and wind and using that to produce hydrogen and exporting hydrogen. Australia is pushing that in a big way. In Europe, Japan, South Korea, USA, all of them, USA apart, setting up hydrogen making facilities and are not setting up hydrogen making facilities on that scale and are likely to import. Now, as we discussed, production of hydrogen is inefficient, and for it to be economically viable depends on the cost of two key factors. One is the cost of input, solar power. The tariff has fallen below 2 rupees a unit, and it could fall further. But keep in mind that this tariff is determined substantially by costs of importing cells, wafers, entire components of solar power systems, and so on. And with one slight tweak of that cost, this value can change dramatically and make hydrogen inviable. In other words, unless we pay attention to the development of the upstream renewable energy chain simultaneously, green hydrogen is at the risk of being captive to supply chain fluctuations. The electrolyzer capex is also currently at about 300 to 350 per kilowatt US dollars, and this is likely projections. Economists make projections, and economists' projections depend on various parameters. It's likely to go to about 200 kilowatt dollars per kilowatt hour. Now, these are two variables. In terms of India, I would say the potential of collaborating nationally and internationally to drive down the electrolyzer capex is an important area we need to focus on. And in developing all the components in the renewable energy supply chain indigenously is another factor which needs a big push in any case. And that's a very big challenge. So currently, green hydrogen can, because of these above two costings, green hydrogen can be produced at US dollar 2.5 to 3 per kg. And this trend suggests it could reach about 1.5 US dollar per kg within 5 years, making it one of the cheapest forms of energy. Famous last words, subject to many variables, and therefore one has to look at this very carefully. Now, the efficiency of electrolyzers will improve. It is likely to improve from about 60% to 70%, and their cost will decrease. And these are substantial value. And this will further reduce the hydrogen cost. It will drive the capex down, but there's a danger that this driving down of capex will be countered by the increase in input costs of energy that needs to be watched out. Now, what are India's routes to a hydrogen economy? One, we have to get started and pick up, immediate viabilities, and they include blending of green hydrogen with CNG. It's mandated by the Supreme Court and to be used in the National Capital Region. Approvals are already in place for this blending by authorities, and CNG blended with green hydrogen is likely to add cost on end consumer. That's an important point. So again, how does one prevent this is a big scientific and technological and economic challenge. The blending of hydrogen in refineries, hydrogen produced from natural gas is used in desulfurization, and green hydrogen can be produced in situ in these plants by using renewable energy and some form of access to that renewable energy. And the blending of green ammonia, 10 to 15% in urea production. Green ammonia can be produced in scale in a central facility, transported and stored for blending. And increasingly, there are technologies which directly use ammonia as a fertilizer. And if that can be also scaled, that will be of some value, both ecologically and commercially. Now, there are some technical and commercial feasibilities in a few years' time if hydrogen becomes widely available. Hydrogen-based long-distance transportation, hydrogen fuel cell-based commercial vehicles like buses and trucks could be valuable. The production-linked incentives which have been given for chemically derived storage systems include production-linked incentive for hydrogen storage and availability and recharging. So it could become viable compared to battery-based EVs for the long range, long distances. Ammonia as a large-scale energy storage, because of its high energy content and ease of transportation, could be ideal for hydrogen, and it liquefies easily under light pressure and chilling, as you all know, and can be transported. And ammonia also can be a fuel for existing gas power plants to generate electricity, and can be cracked into hydrogen and then be used in our existing power plants, thereby with reduced or zero carbon footprint. Synthetic fuels, green hydrogen along with the carbon captured from air can be used to produce synthetic fuels. And again, these fuels can be ensured to be carbon neutral. Now, there are many big opportunities, and if you're a hydrogen aficionado, you would put that. But also at the same time, these challenges need to be kept in mind. Solar power is cheapest and tariff is further going down. Our nuclear sector, despite the current capex costs, as it grows, will provide a very long-term, reliable source of energy. Those costs are currently high. They need to come down, and hopefully they will. Huge land with good solar insolation in Rajasthan, Gujarat, MP, UP, and southern states are available. That's a very positive aspect. But the land scale of land required and the environmental costs of those lands also need to be factored in. It will be very readily used for solar power generation now, as we require more and more. But as we install more solar capacity, there will be both environmental and commercial reasons and push back on those parameters. So those need to be kept in mind. Now, cost of green hydrogen, green ammonia in these balancing situations could be made because of solar power and other renewable power availability could become very cheap in India, and India could become a manufacturing hub. As if it becomes a manufacturing hub of solar cells, modules, electrolyzers, fuel cells, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, then this entire supply chain can be placed in a manner where hydrogen becomes viable. India can also be a major exporter of green hydrogen and ammonia after meeting domestic demand, and this will allow us to substantially decarbonize our economy. Now, we've had discussions with multiple stakeholders, and here are some suggestions which have come, and more are welcome. These are not, some things which are written in stone. Indeed, they have not yet been finalized in any way. They have just been points which people have contributed. They include introduction of a mandatory green hydrogen purchase obligation to develop a market, and this will also include green ammonia, green hydrogen. Natural gas distribution companies can be required to have mandatory blending, volumetric blending with PNG. Oil refineries and steel manufacturing can again have mandatory blending of green hydrogen with gray hydrogen produced from carbon-based sources and SMRs, for example. And then fertilizer companies can have mandatory blending of green ammonia in urea manufacture. Open access for renewable energy producers to transmit power for producing green hydrogen at consumption locations. If you, for example, you can produce green hydrogen in if you can produce power in, let's say, Rajasthan, but you want to produce the hydrogen in Delhi, then there should be some incentive for, that power to be transmitted to Delhi and be used for hydrogen manufacture, rather than have the hydrogen plant in Rajasthan and transport the hydrogen. So those are the kinds of benefits which could be there. Low-cost banking facility for renewable hydrogen or green hydrogen for ammonia production would be valuable. And there are, of course, a variety of waivers on imported goods for green hydrogen facility. These need to be looked at in balance. When you waive import duties in one case, it affects other industries locally for other reasons. So that's a complicated aspect. Industry keeps demanding a corporate tax holidays in these kinds of rising sectors, and they would also want these kinds of accelerated depreciation and domestic sale of ammonia and green hydrogen to help raise low cost. All these barriers which industry say, facilities and barriers which industry want, suggest the complications inherently in making green hydrogen viable economically. So the scientific and technological benefits of clean energy source need to be balanced with these internal perception issues which cause industry to make these kinds of suggestions. Now, I'll conclude by saying that a hydrogen mission has been launched. The Ministry of New and Renewable Energy Resources is driving that mission, and will be collaborating with all the other ministries and industry and stakeholders. And the solar power development is successful, and hopefully in a similar way, not hopefully, I think it's very likely that the hydrogen mission will be successful. Will this result in a greater use of hydrogen in certain kinds of sectors which I've mentioned? Likely, if we have a situation where the renewable energy power source costs don't rise in an unreasonable manner. So I'd like to stop here, and thank you very, very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Raghavan, for a brief but very exciting talk. I guess we now know what government is looking into in terms of hydrogen economy, at least. And I think some of the suggestion like mandatory blending of the green hydrogen or green ammonia, I think that will help. Otherwise, we know that these are expensive as compared to the hydrogen coming from the fossil fuels. There are several questions. I request the audience to write the questions in a Q&A box. But before we take the questions from the QA box, I think we take this opportunity to ask some of the questions from our core members. So we at least had some questions that we like to ask Professor Vijay Raghavan. As you clearly said that the either the hydrogen generation or the storage, there is still challenging, and we really need some radical development in the field of research and technology. So that means we need even more fundamental research with the translational goals for developing processes and technology based on the fundamental research. But then, is it not a good idea to start some sort of an independent research institute which only focuses on, say, solar energy, green fuel, carbon capture and utilization, with extraordinary world-class facilities, engineering support, funding? Because whatever we say, that we know that our research facilities is still moderate, I would say, at the best. And if one compare with the world-class institute, and this is one of the very serious problem. We all agree about that climate change is a very serious problem, and solution is in the fundamental research with the translational goal. So, do you think it will be a good idea to have some sort of a focus, high-class research institute for this research?
Yeah, thank you. Let me step back a little bit from the institute point. What do we need to have a strong industrial scale presence in both solar energy and its development, so that renewable energy of that kind and other kinds are, the entire supply chain or large parts of the supply chain are manufactured in India, and consequently also for hydrogen, production, what kind of research to translation do we need? Now, in our ecosystem, the strength is that we have a capacity to understand what is needed very well. And that's not a small thing. That comes from both theoretical and experimental capabilities which are strong. These capabilities are, for good or for worse, distributed. And our challenge is to make it, for good rather than for worse. You will have capabilities in the National Chemical Laboratory, in the National Electrochemical Research Institute, in TIFR, in IIT Bombay, in IIT Madras, in IIT Jodhpur and Gandhinagar, and so on. Now, this distributed nature of these fundamental capabilities is something to be kept in mind and should be made a virtue. The second level which we need for this whole ecosystem to flourish are substantially sized investments in prototyping and development centers, which can take what happens in laboratories onto a scale which industry can play with and develop. Now, this is a tough one, because you want to do this so that it's accessible to all those in the distributed system, yet you want to localize it so that these technologies are available in one place. It is complicated, and it's best to learn from some examples which have reasonably worked. One is the Andhra Pradesh MedTech Zone, started by Dr. Jitendra Sharma, and he's driven it really well. It is located in Visakhapatnam, but it's got extraordinary facilities for industry to come, small scale industry and medium scale industry, even large industry to come and take products of research to develop. And the way Jitendra Sharma and his team do that is, at one level, he's scouting the entire ecosystem for what is there at early stage of research. At the other extreme, he's looking at finished products and seeing which of those products need to be made in India. And he puts the gap for prototyping available on large scale. So it is a very distributed kind of institution which focuses on translation. And indeed, it is not one institution, there are many, many institutions there. If you create a focused institution for research institutions or for hydrogen or for renewable energy, the danger is that it will be like one of our national labs. In a positive sense, it will have great value because it will have scientific and technological capability. But without this ecosystem connect I talked about, it will not function. So you will create, for example, another version of the Central Electrochemical Research Institute, but for another purpose. And that will have great value, but that's not enough given the network challenges in India. Sorry for taking so long.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I think we agree with that. Another question is, now we know that Indian government is really encouraging to start the startups and to take some of the research to the next level, to the industry level. But if you look at the several research institutes and university, they don't allow their faculties and students to start. Right? There are these very old British era rules which doesn't allow the faculties and even the student even start the non-profit organization, non-profit company. So can the government do something in that direction where it can have some sort of blanket permission to faculties and students to have at least a non-profit start?
This, you have raised a very important issue. There is a 2009 office memorandum which specifically permits individuals and urges institutions to have collaborations and have faculty start, can have startups and companies and so on and so forth. Now, this, as you all know, has been more effective in its absence in our research institutions, but it's been extraordinarily amplified more recently, particularly in our engineering institutions, where startups have grown enormously, and increasingly now, while startups grew over the last 5 to 7 years substantially, the complaint was that faculty members did not have startups, and there were one or two notable exceptions. That has also started changing in places such as IIT Madras and IIT Bombay and IIT Delhi. So somehow the engineering ecosystem, and I'm not talking only about e-commerce, in other areas also have been involved in startups a lot more than our top research institutions. That attitude needs to change substantially. It's an internal institutional problem. Dr. Chidambaram once told me that many people in our institutions understand that the safest aircraft is one which doesn't take off. So the trouble with starting any industry is you will have to take risks of various kinds. You will make some mistakes, and the institution should help you rectify the mistakes and not penalize you for that. So that kind of attitude change has come in our engineering institutions. It needs to come in our national institutions. So it's not just what the government does, but the governing bodies and everyone else should encourage this and make this feasible. It's possible. And I think it's happening in some situations.
Okay. Thank you for that. Saying that, I guess that will encourage the other institute to do that. So my last question from our group, and then we will take the questions from the other members. As you clearly said, that industry has to play a very important role if we want to take our fundamental research from the lab to the commercial scale. But our experience, at least with the Indian industries, they are not really that excited about long-term research investment. They want a ready-made solution, right, within a quick time. So how do we change this particular situation where Indian industry really respect the research part of development and they really invest into the long-term research, which can finally yield good processes and good product and technologies?
The problem here is we have been talking for a while in a manner which we have been giving truisms to industry or to academia and then trying to wonder why something has not happened. Now, there could be two reasons why industry's investment in R&D is relatively low. One is, for some reasons, they just want easy profits. They're not interested in R&D investment and so on. And this could be a component. But many industries today, it's very nice to see some new industries are very keen on getting into cutting edge deep tech, ideas which are implementable and scalable. The problem, in my view, is that industry has a legitimate issue which needs to be addressed. And that issue is that industry has got capital, but industry doesn't have risk capital. And the amount of investment in R&D by a company such as GE or Google or a pharma company, each one of them invests more than the entire funds which the US National Science Foundation spends every year. In other words, for industry to invest in cutting edge R&D, it has to come up with a different strategy to make its buck go a lot longer and mitigate risk. That is eminently feasible because our research institutions, our DRDO labs, CSIR labs, TIFR and other places have enormous talent, enormous infrastructure, and also land. If they partner with industry to mitigate industry's risk on specific projects and develop, co-develop the R to the D end and go past the value of death, enormous things can happen. This requires fire in the belly on both sides. this is readily doable. The rules and flexibilities are there, and if necessary, they can be changed and enabled. But we really need to push that. The cultural issue which needs to be addressed here is an attitude which we need to get out of, and it's an attitude not in the government. It is an attitude going downstream. That the fear that somehow I will have to take a decision to partner with a specific industry on my soil on a specific project, drives people to end up with very democratic, equitable solutions of partnership which don't go anywhere. So a mechanism to grasp the nettles and have specific partnerships of value to take on big ticket research in industry interested areas is very important.
Okay, thank you. I have one follow-up question. In your presentation, you showed that the industries are asking you for this 7 years tax vacation. So ideally, we should ask them to pay the CO2 tax, right? Rather than they asking for the tax vacation.
Absolutely. The reason for showing those was not to say that those are the right approaches or not. That's a separate discussion. But the moment, there are two reasons again why industry asks for these kinds of breaks. One, it's a legitimate one to develop, protect themselves in a early stage development and competitiveness, legitimate in quotes. The other is that, a lazy approach to say that, okay, we should get all the breaks. The problem with the break kind of system is that what is a break for you in one industry is a problem for another industry, so this keeps getting into endless discussion. So somehow to incentivize without giving a fiscal window of these kinds, if that is feasible, that is always better. And therefore, industry academia collaboration is one way where the cost can be reduced.
Okay, thank you. So now I request the other members, the panelists.
Vivek, I will go.
Yes,
yeah.
Rajneesh.
Yeah, Professor Vijay Raghavan, really nice to know about the roadmap on green hydrogen. I was wondering, does the government also thinks about the gray hydrogen and the blue hydrogen, also the purple hydrogen, whether there is a roadmap for that? And why I'm saying this, because the technology which is available right now is available for gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen. And as far as decarbonizing the economy is concerned, you can always achieve that by going gray or blue route. Even the Australia, all the hydrogen which they export, mostly they get it through either gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen. So I really don't see a push, at least whatever I have heard mostly, there is no push for gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen in our country at this moment.
So there are 2 points here. One, green hydrogen, as I pointed out, is energetically a long and costly shot, right? No
Yes.
question about that. It is necessary from a philosophical reason of purity, as it were, right?
Almost 15 to 20%.
Right?
So sorry.
Someone was interrupting. But yeah, so that doesn't mean that other forms of energy which we use, right, from coal to, petroleum imports and all sorts of things will stop overnight. And not only that, nor will derivative forms of getting hydrogen stop. It will have to go as a mix and keep pushing and to see what is feasible. Fundamentally, we have to go back to another question. While we look at all the greening options, they're very correct and important, but they have to be managed in partnership with our developmental goals to see how we can make them maximally sustainable, but also at the same time not compromise on development, right? It is lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty is the key, goal which we have in mind, and that cannot be compromised, and that has to be done in a maximally green manner. And developed countries need to be pushed for tech transfer and other kinds of transfers which allow a net zero carbon growth, net zero carbon output globally, but national goals should be set according to national priorities, right? To demand that countries such as India do only one kind of energy approach is not feasible for a variety of real reasons and also for historical reasons, economic reasons, and in terms of going ahead. So yeah, so the one has to take a pragmatic approach.
Yeah, because economical reason plays a significant role over here. Huge amount of manpower is employed in coal sector currently. And if we don't talk about gray hydrogen at all, then I don't know how we are going to basically identify a source of income for that huge.
All of that, as economic trends change, people will move to other jobs. That's a more layered issue. It's a very important issue, but those issues, of course, will be addressed in layer after layer. But specifically, hydrogen is not going to impact or not impact on that very soon, because there isn't a policy which says that you should use only green hydrogen and nothing else.
Okay.
There are policies which enable the development of green hydrogen, but it's not stopping coal, for example.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Vijayaraghavan. Really nice. Vivek, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Rajneesh. Any other questions from the panelists? Yeah, Professor Yadav.
Yes,
Yes,
good afternoon, Professor Vijayaraghavan. I'm sorry I joined your lecture because I was giving lecture in another conference, international, where they were talking about leveraging R&D for economic growth.
If you ask me a difficult question, Dr. Yadav, I'll ask Dr. Kakodkar to answer it.
No, the question is very simple, actually. We'll have something like 25% contribution for green hydrogen by 2040 at least, and remaining to the energy sector will come from solar, wind, maybe geothermal. Okay, but the material and chemicals must come from use of biomass and the carbon dioxide, whether it comes from power plants or any other source. That carbon dioxide, the so-called carbon dioxide refineries, which will be converted into methanol, formic acid, dimethyl ether, hydrocarbons, and name it, including green ammonia. Okay, all these things will come from hydrogen. So we are talking about blue hydrogen and green hydrogen by 2050. However, I wrote this article where I argued that we should not be wasting the biofuels. Okay, we should not be wasting on biofuels, because carbon should not be used as a biofuel, but carbon should be used for materials and chemicals, because that is not going to achieve us that 1.5 degrees C, goal, or for that matters, the so-called net zero by 2050. And we gave with examples, and we have calculated this based on the published data by Department of Energy, USA, and all that. And that paper, that article of mine became very popular. Just exactly a year ago, I had published that article.
Can you send a copy, please?
I will send you a copy, including I will send a copy about, and I will tell you something else. How we...
Maybe, Dr. Yadav, you should put that link to that on the chat box so that everyone...
I will do that. I will do that. Another interesting part I will tell you, that I can produce hydrogen at US $1, less than $1 per kg. Now, when Mukesh Ambani said that, everybody started saying is, I've been saying it for last 5 years. I've been saying that I can produce hydrogen, green hydrogen at $1, less than $1. And, deliberately I've given leverage for that oxygen, because 1 mole of water gives me 1 mole of, for example, 1 mole of hydrogen gives me 8 kg. Rather, 1 kg of hydrogen gives me 8 kg of oxygen. And oxygen today commercial is 10 cents a kg. So you can imagine that we will have at least 80 cent, valorization by oxygen itself. And so my work has been supported by ONGC, but they were very sluggish in, and I've been having the pilot plant and everything to demonstrate that. Only just last week, we talked about it and they said, okay, we'll start it in Goa. So we are going to start that. Our patents, and another interesting part, dimethyl ether is a substitute for LPG and also diesel. And the same infrastructure which is used for LPG can be used. And I have now signed an agreement with Godavari Biorefinery where I'm transferring this technology. However, Government of India has not given any policy on that dimethyl ether to be used as a diesel substitute. That is not there. We also have methanol technology. So my plea to you, because you are the PSO, to see that the government has appropriate policy for dimethyl ether, methanol, yes, just yesterday I published an article in Green Chemistry Journal on methanol economy and net zero goal. So I can send you these articles to you. Maybe Suresh can pass on to them to you. But I have your email ID also. But this, I'm very happy that you are spearheading this national hydrogen mission, which is a topic very dear to me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yadav. Thank you very much. Professor Kakurkar, do you want to make any remarks?
I hope so. I mean,
No.
it would be very valuable to hear his comments.
Yes.
Dr. Kakurkar, please.
No, I had no intention of speaking. I come here only to listen. But let me carry forward from where Professor Yadav stopped. You know, ONGC Energy Center has been supporting this work, what Dr. Yadav mentioned. But now that Energy Center's existence itself seems to be in difficulties. Now, there are calculations given by Professor Yadav to in fact show that thermochemical splitting of water could in fact be cheaper. And, you know, all these targets that you are looking for, the cost of green hydrogen can be brought down. Now, there is a big technology challenge, there are material challenge, there is a process challenge. But these things require concerted effort. You know, it cannot be done by doing one project for 2-3 years, then going to sleep about it, then somebody else raising some very fundamental questions which should have been talked about 20 years earlier. So this is one of the challenge that we see. But leave that as it were. In the context of this particular kind of gathering, where of course you have researchers of all kinds, but I would say there is a relatively higher concentration of people working in basic research. I think this is such a big field, and there are so many kind of pathways being tried out. Now, certainly we should look at some of them which show a great promise and work on that. So that's more on the engineering and technology route to kind of address our green hydrogen ambition. But I think there are far too many pathways which are open on the more fundamental side. Can we prepare hydrogen differently? Can we use, for example, rather than producing electricity and then producing hydrogen, or rather than producing high temperature and then producing hydrogen, can we use solar light and do some band gap engineering, where many of these efficiency problems and all can be overcome much neater through that approach.
Yeah.
Now, these are the kind of problems that this community can address. And I suggest that, if everybody wants to take everything that is around, then we'll be only adding knowledge contribution to the world without getting a technology in our hand. On the other hand, I think we should create strategies and decide that, well, here I'm going to follow pure engineering way and do something which may not be most ideal, but for results. There is another route. Maybe I will choose 3 or 4 most promising pathways and take it to a level up to demonstration plants and see what does it cost. And then choose one or some of them or none of them, depending on what the picture is. And then, of course, on the basic research, you follow maybe 50 pathways, so that you suddenly get a major kind of breakthrough in some area. So that, I think, has to get into our strategy planning. I don't see that anywhere happening. But in the context of these issues, this is very important. The third point that I wish to make is this nexus between the policy, the economics, and research. Now, they are all intertwined. You can make a wonderful solution coming out of research and technology to be completely nonplussed by inadequate policy, or at least, your policy coming maybe 10 years too late, it doesn't help. Because by that time, those options will get rejected. Suppose somebody works out a good technology option, and then somebody will say, no, but today's present cost, this is 2 times as expensive, so not worth doing it. And this is where a more fundamental look is necessary. And we should be proactive on policies as well. Don't have to look at the world. We should look at India and what should be our policies, and shape our policies so that the promising development that we do, which is sound on a fundamental basis, and then we give make success in the commercial world or the economic domain, because there is a policy support. A phase lag in these things is actually a killer, and in this country we've seen that several times. So and I think this problem of hydrogen is of that kind. But having said that, I still want to, I think we should recognize that hydrogen is not energy. Hydrogen is energy carrier. And conceptually, there is a big difference in the approach in terms of energy and energy carrier. Now, in terms of primary energy of different kinds, including renewable energy, nuclear, and all the rest, and the energy carriers which transport that energy to the end user, there has to be this global understanding in terms of what kind of energy carrier is convenient for what kind of purposes. Now, today, as you know, electricity, which is a very important carrier, it caters to only around 19, maybe 20% of the energy use at the user end. Now, tomorrow, with emphasis on e-mobility, maybe that 20% will go to 30%, 35%. You give further emphasis on hydrogen mobility, maybe it will go to another 10% more. There is a large segment in industry where you use coal or oil or gas as heat source. Maybe you can use green heat sources for doing that. In which case, and if that green source is derived out of electricity, the share of electricity, I had done some back of envelope calculation, can go up as high as 80%. Now, on the other hand, many of these materials are also required for process, as Professor Yadav was telling. And so you have to look at the energy requirements and the material requirements together. And all this must get factored into an overall roadmap, which should be pushed by the government on policy, which should be pushed by industry in terms of co-investments along with the government. And of course, taking it, and we should be pushed by academia or research community to go forward. So I think we need a coordinated program of that kind. Because otherwise what will happen is we'll develop policies looking at what is happening elsewhere. And then I'll use my famous term and stop. Most of our policies get determined by the vendors. So our policies are vendor driven. And then we'll do a lot of research and then finally adopt whatever has happened elsewhere. That should not happen because it's costing us dear in solar energy, as you very correctly pointed out. Same thing will repeat in hydrogen. So I will stop here, Dr. Vijayaraghavan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kakodkar. This has been very useful. Let me take home 2 points which I will try to coordinate meetings with all the stakeholders here and elsewhere to push. One is for the R&D itself, as you pointed out, we need a approach taking off from what Vivek said, may not need a research institution, but a networked institutional like structure to, in a focused manner, address and solve technological problems as well as have a broader fundamental base. That is something which needs to be pushed. The second and very important general statement, which is valid everywhere, but is particularly valid here for us today, is where does policy derive from? And policy right now, even when it is derived from a national set of policy makers looking at techno-economic aspects of energy, for example, they are not connected to the research community and the research problem in an organic manner. And therefore, you see results which are cut and paste of various kinds or imported vendor-driven programs. So these two areas will push substantially. So that there's a national policy-driven setup which links with the scientific community also.
Okay, thank you, Professor Vijayaraghavan. I think, Professor Vijayaraghavan, you have to go at after 8:10, so we have a few minutes. So can I take some of the questions from the audience?
Absolutely, and if you could actually save all those questions, maybe and by we can also respond. But yeah, go ahead, please.
Yes, so I've selected just few so that we will not have the same question repeated. So Santosh Singh is asking, currently Ireland has launched a technology where 4,000 tons of CO2 can be captured out of the air every year. This kind of a development is being done in other part of the world, but not in India. What do you think? Where India are lagging to lead the world in this direction? Is it scientific approach which is responsible, or is it governmental policies which are not focused in this direction? What should be our approach as an early age scientist?
This is a very broad question you are asking about, carbon capture. Are we going to go down that direction in principle? If yes, then what kind of carbon capture technologies and storage and utilization technologies are we going to go on? In principle, I don't think there is a scientific objection to getting into these kinds of technologies. The issue is about prioritization and cost, and and the R&D aspect. So I think it's a very exciting, broadly an exciting area. There are many proven technologies which are available. They need to go past the techno-economic barrier to be useful. But as far as I know, in India, NTPC is focusing on many of these technologies, having a variety of carbon capture and utilization technologies in addition to their power plants, but I don't know of anyone else directly looking at this. I mean, big power plants have started, and I think newer plants will also do that. The potential ultra supercritical power plant which is being developed also has carbon capture and utilization addendum to it. So these are happening. I don't know what scale they're already happening. Maybe someone can point out that.
Thank you. Another question is by Sanjay Dodia. We as a country have a big electrolysis chemicals like chloroalkali, but lack the indigenous technology. How we expect the green H2 be viable with the imported water splitting tech in India?
So right now, if you talk to industry, they said, oh, electrolysis is not a problem. They're basically importing the technology, and depending on the cost of the input energy, this is viable or not. If you talk to researchers, for example, at the Central Electrochemical Research Institute and elsewhere, they will tell you that they've got much better technologies and they're working at the front end and so on. My concern there is a different one, which is how far are they from, industry adoption and commercialization. So I don't think there is an issue about understanding technology and what needs to be done, but there are a variety of institutions, like Dr. Kakorkar said, which need to coordinate the research to development to translation very speedily. And that coordination, as Dr. Kakorkar pointed out, is absent and needs to be put in place.
Okay, thank you. I think next question is a perfect follow-up of what you said by Mr. Pradeep Kumar. He says, sir, I could see world-class research inside institution in India, but what is the barrier that stops conversion of research from institution to solutions for society, especially in the field of green fuels and sustainable development?
See, this is a complex general question. And there have been research institutions, Yadav is from UDCT. I keep forgetting UDCT's new name. I call it UDCT, it reflects my age. But, the point is there are institutions which have done extraordinary translation. That is not the issue. If you look at the partnership which was there between TIFR and BARC in the early days, quite extraordinary. If you look at, multiple other kinds of CSR laboratories in the early days, they were pushing for translation. The National Aerospace Laboratory still does that. Other labs do it less. So a generalization that it is not happening is not correct. What are the current barriers to expansion of that is an interesting one. I would say the barriers are that we're looking too much at our national labs for this. A national lab should be intertwined with our universities. Physically, it may not be possible now, but emotionally they should be connected and should have interactions. And together they should have challenging, programs which are driven. Our metrics for evaluation and promotion, many people say should move away from academic success to this. I agree fully. But metrics alone is not the solution. It is also a sense of purpose which is shared and a fire in the belly to solve these kinds of things which need to be amplified. Some places have it very well, but so we should learn from those.
Yeah, thank you. The last question by Mr. Sachin Kumar. Solar plants will contribute a lot to the global warming, which add to the cost of the entire project. So the idea of producing H2 by splitting water using solar power is environmentally and economically feasible, as recycling of waste solar panels add another cost to the project. So, so he's saying that whether this is really a economically viable process.
Time will tell. See, the problem, I completely agree. The challenge is that the real costs vary. Many costs are hidden. Environmental costs you're asking future generation to pay. These all need to be balanced, and these are different levels of priorities. My bias is that, all these technologies are very important, but the full 360 life cycle costs also need to be constantly reevaluated and calculated. And similarly, the other side, when you look at nuclear power, we should similarly make calculations not just about the current costs, but the long-term benefits also. And that is tough for societies because you're talking about investment now, return now. These long-term issues, somehow to communicate and put value to them is one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Vijay Raghavan. I know you have to go at.
I have to run. I'll be in trouble otherwise.
Yes.
So if you will excuse me, thank you
Yes.
very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thank you, Dr. Kakodkar, Dr. Yadav, Vivek, Tapas, everyone else, Rajneesh, for your interventions, and also those on the chat box which I've seen. And this is a really great set of people. Little more weightage on the basic science side, as Dr. Kakodkar said, but nevertheless of great value. And therefore, our integration with industry and entrepreneurship would be a great impact. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, Professor. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yadav, Professor Kakodkar, Professor Lakshmikantam, our advisory members. Thank you for joining us and hope to see you again in the next webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Great job, Vivek. Great job.
Bye-bye, Vivek.
Bye-bye.
Everyone else.